All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick on the Power. So I wanted to make a video about the relationship between Joe Weider and Arnold Schwarzenegger. So for those of you who don't know, Joe Weider is the founder of the IFBB. He founded it in 1946, and he is also credited to be the person that basically discovered the talent that was Arnold Schwarzenegger. So Joe Weider discovered Arnold when he was very young. I believe he was either 18 or 19, and then he brought Arnold over to the United States in 1968, where Arnold would begin his bodybuilding career. And as many of us know, his bodybuilding career would include winning 7 Mr. Olympia titles and 5 Mr. Universe titles before his career would end. So the bodybuilding scene in the 1960s and 1970s pretty much recognized that Arnold Schwarzenegger was pretty much Joe Weider's special project, his golden boy, and they pretty much knew that Joe Weider was really pushing hard for Arnold Schwarzenegger to be successful. But the reason I'm making this particular video is I came across a very interesting article titled "Pimping Iron" by Irv Muchnick. So essentially the premise of this article was about Vince McMahon starting his World Bodybuilding Federation and trying to be competition to Joe Weider and the IFBB. So it talks a lot about the history of the IFBB, the history of, Vince McMahon's WWF and pro wrestling, and it goes a little bit into the history of bodybuilding. So in that article, he quotes Joe Weider from an interview that Joe Weider did with some reporter. So this is what he claims Joe Weider said. So when associates were asking him why Schwarzenegger had won that year's Mr. Olympia, that was 1970, when Sergio Oliva, a black Cuban, had clearly had the better physique, Joe smiled and said, "I put Sergio on the cover and I sell X magazines. I put Arnold on the cover and I sell 3 times the number of magazines." So essentially, if that quote is true, he's saying that Arnold was selling more magazine covers and that's why Arnold won in 1970. Now, I'm currently showing you guys a couple of photos from the 1970 Mr. Olympia, so you guys can be the judge of who you think looked better. Now, it would be one thing if 1970 was the only year where there was a little bit of controversy regarding Arnold and Joe Weider, but it was far from being the only year where there was some controversy and Arnold won the Olympia. So just 1 year later, at the 1971 Mr. Olympia, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the only competitor, and that was a year he won the Olympia. Obviously, he was the only one competing. And a lot of people speculate that that was set up by Joe Weider to ensure that Arnold would win back-to-back Olympias in 70 and 71. Now, 71 was the year they disqualified a lot of competitors for competing in rival organizations. That's when the IFBB was trying to really monopolize bodybuilding and become the only premier bodybuilding federation by telling their athletes, if you compete elsewhere, you can't compete in the Mr. Olympia. And of course, Sergio Oliva, who was Arnold's main competition, was one of the guys disqualified in 1971. But the interesting thing about 1971 was that this was the year that Sergio began to work with Arthur Jones, who was the founder of Nautilus Training Equipment. And a lot of people say that this year was one of the years he looked the best that he ever looked due to this new method of training. And he was actually allowed to guest pose at the 1971 Mr. Olympia. And he looked absolutely phenomenal. So a lot of people think that Joe Weider was afraid that Sergio was going to beat Arnold that year, and that's why he was disqualified. And that's the real reason why the non-sanctioned policy was introduced in 1971, was simply to keep Arnold from losing. And then in 1972, Sergio would lose to Arnold again. And at that point in time, this would be the first time that Sergio would publicly say he thought the fix was in for Arnold to win and that he would never win an Olympia again because this was Joe Weider's rising star and, Sergio was just going to get in the way. So after losing in 1972, he was vocal about the fact that he thought Joe was rigging competitions for Arnold. Even though personally I believe if you look at these photos from the 1972 Mr. Olympia, I think Arnold was the better bodybuilder at that year's show. So let's fast forward to 1973 to a little something known as the Tijuana incident. So in 1973, Sergio was competing at a competition known as the Mr. International Azteca competition. And in the audience of that competition was both Joe Weider and Arnold Schwarzenegger. So they didn't know that he was competing there. He was kind of a surprise entrant. And then he challenged Arnold to come up on stage and do a pose down with him on kind of a neutral ground because this was a rival federation to Joe Weider's. So Joe obviously didn't have any say in who would win. So Oliva challenged him to come up on stage, and then Joe would kind of get on stage and neutralize the situation, and Arnold would never face off against him on stage in this neutral ground. But they ended up having Franco Columbu get on stage and compete against Sergio, and Sergio handily beat him. So there's actually another version of this story in the book Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors Volume 2, where they say that According to Dan Laurie, Arnold was actually at this competition not to watch the competition, but he was planning on competing in this Mr. International Azteca. But when they saw that Sergio showed up, they were very scared and they didn't know that he was going to compete. So when they saw that Sergio was competing, Joe Weider brought 3 of his own judges and tried to put them on the judging panel. And when they refused to put them on the panel, that's when he pulled Arnold out of the show. So then obviously we would not see Sergio compete at the 1973 Mr. Olympia. Then he would go on several rampages, accusing Joe Weider of fixing shows and picking the judges and things of that nature all throughout 1974. And then after all the talking that Sergio did in 1974, Joe Weider actually, reciprocated, and he wrote an article in one of his magazines entitled it "Sergio Oliva, a Chicken Without a Head," kind of insulting Sergio's tirade against the IFBB. Then, of course, you can fast forward all the way to the 1980 Mr. Olympia, where Arnold made his comeback, and many people think he did not deserve to win because he was not really looking his best. But a lot of people think the Weiders had him win anyway because he was pursuing that career in Hollywood, and they kind of knew he was going to blow up and bring a lot of attention to bodybuilding, so he then won that 1980 Mr. Olympia. But these are just a few examples of where you could make an argument that Arnold was being pushed very heavily and that competitions may or may not have been rigged in favor of Arnold. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you think Joe Weider had any role in rigging competitions to any extent to push Arnold? And do you think Sergio deserved to win in any of those years? So let me know what you guys think. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.